Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So we started this Gemara, and we are going to continue. It's an involved sugya, an involved Talmudic discussion that, as I mentioned the other time, is found here, but also found in many other places in the Talmud in various variations. And our Talmud is going to cite some of those other places. And it ends up becoming a real complicated situation. In a certain sense, Talmud actually acknowledges it. And we will see how the complexity, pushes and pulls people back and forth in terms of their views on certain things. So we are on 10a1, and we looked at, on the left-hand side in the Gemara, the left-hand column. We basically read that left-hand column. Rabbi Yitzchak brings up this very intriguing situation of Beit Chonyo, the temple, the house built by Onias, and that was built as in hundreds of years earlier. But he says, you know what? And again, a little bit of it's curious. He says, you know what? If there were a Beit Chonyo today, meaning in the middle of the third century CE, when he's living, let's say, 250, 270 CE, he says, then we could offer, or people could offer sacrifices in that temple. That's his statement, right? And then the Gemara deduces from that he must be of the opinion that the sanctification that was initially created for the land of Israel, for Jerusalem, for the temple, was only temporary, that it wasn't once and for all, but that it had been dispelled or dissolved or canceled, and it will require when the time of the redemption comes, Mashiach Zeiten, the time of the Messiah, La'atid Lavo, it'll need to be sanctified all over again. So because had the sanctification persisted from the beginning, then one would not be able, here comes the interruption. So I'm gonna hold on a half a second, please. Be patient, please.
Does anybody know who was taken to the hospital?
No, the rabbi didn't say.
I asked Rabbi if we were going to finish our tractate before he retires. And I was skeptical, but he said we were going to try.
Yeah, just talk fast. Just talk faster, right?
I mean, it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like it's unless we significantly speed up the pace.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that'll be one of the classes that he aspires to teach in his retirement. We can join.
Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking he was talking about teaching in Israel.
That's what I sort of assumed too, but I don't know. I didn't ask him.
Oh, we can zoom in.
Zoom in there too, right?
Yeah, well, in a year, who knows? In a year, the Messiah could have come.
I don't know who he teaches. I don't know where he's teaching in Israel. It's
Does he teach in English or Hebrew there?
He goes in the summer.
Yeah, it was always in Jerusalem, I think. Maybe there was one thing in Tel Aviv. I think it was in Jerusalem, but
I thought it was Tel Aviv.
Okay, you may be right.
It's a Masorti yeshiva, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the conservative yeshiva was in Jerusalem, and the one in Tel Aviv was for basically like us, but more knowledgeable adult people who were studying it. That may have been the one that was in Tel Aviv, but I really don't know. You sound more knowledgeable about this, Stuart.
But how long did it take us to get through the last tractate? It was like 5 years.
No, not quite that long, I don't think, but a couple of years. I'll say 3 years, at least. you can sort of could lead to an appreciation of the practice of the daf yomi,
Yeah.
which mostly the ultra orthodox do. They may not go in depth, but they get through it. It's 3
Right.
years. It's 3 years to get through the whole thing.
Yeah, I did a little bit of study with the Chabad rabbi, and his pace is, is many times what David's pace is. And,
Well, I have the feeling that they assume,
That
not unreasonably, that people who are studying that have been
Yeah.
doing it basically since Cheder.
yeah, I think they're also I think their goals are different. I think they're looking more for halakha.
Okay, we're back.
Ah,
So, so Rabbi Yitzchak says that if a sanctity, he says we could do sacrifices, and the Talmud therefore deduces from that he must be of the opinion that the sanctification of the temple and everything connected with it had dissolved. Because had this sanctification persisted, then we would not be able to offer sacrifices outside of the chosen temple of God, the central shrine in Jerusalem. That's where we are now. So now we're at this very interesting little tidbit. The last 2 lines at the bottom of the left-hand column, 10A1. Those who heard. Who's going to read for us today? Whoops. Sorry, the whole time I was on silence. I had silenced my thing. So nobody heard anything I said. Huh?
yeah, we heard.
Did
it.
No, we heard.
Oh, so I just didn't hear. Okay, good. Good, you hear everything I said. So we're on the last 2 lines. Who's reading?
I stand ready, but I
right.
invite anybody else.
Take a seat, please, but read. You are standing ready.
Okay. All right, so it's going to be me then.
Yes, it is.
Okay. They also serve who only sit and read.
Right.
Those who heard reports of Rabbi Yitzchak's statement said to him, "Did you really say it?" He answered them, "No." That is, he retracted his statement.
Okay. So I'll go a little further.
Rava said, "By God, he did say it, and I personally learned it from him."
Stop. Okay. So here we have like a little story here, a little backstory. So first of all, of course, what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying is a little shocking, right? It's not something that we would expect. We sort of take it for granted that the temple is the be all and end all, and certainly by his time, it was not a regular practice for people to offer sacrifices all over the place. So they said, perhaps in a and again, how we imagine the background of the question. Was it in astonishment? Was it because they were outraged? What it was exactly is not clear. And then he denies that he said it. So you have in the editorial continuation of the translation, he answered them no. And then you have the editorial in the other in the lighter font. That is, he retracted his statement. That's the editor. The Talmud doesn't say that.
Yeah.
The Talmud just reports this blank, bland statement. He said no. When somebody says, "I never said that," they could be saying all kinds of things. They could have said it, but they don't want to talk to you about it. Leave me alone. They could be saying that's not exactly what I meant. I'm being quoted out of context. I never said what you think I said. There are a zillion ways that no could be interpreted. So whether he really retracted his statement or not is up for grabs yet, and something that any person learning the sugya actually should leave as a complicated question and not flatten it out the way they do by simply saying that he retracted his statement. So he's backtracking somehow, and then Rava says, "Of course he did. Don't tell me he didn't say it. I was right there when he said it. I was sitting there studying with him, studying from him. I learned it from him. He taught me this. Don't tell me he didn't say it." And of course, there's all kinds of not only personal ways of doing this, but again, as I said before, if this was a controversial statement, he also could have felt pressured to retract. We've had this throughout history. All kinds of people have been involved in experiences like that. And in the world of Torah studies, unfortunately, it's also not been unheard of that a rabbi would say certain things, and then because other people pressured him that they were unhappy with something that he said, he considered what was right and he said it, and then there was such an uproar that he ended up retracting. So we're not quite sure yet here what's at stake, but Rava feels that he wants to put it on record. Don't just take this simply. He really said it. And then he says, however, what he is responding to is there's a challenge here, not not necessarily some kind of nefarious business, but he was challenged by a very solid Talmudic question. So Rav Murray asked him a big question. All right, why did he retract? Because of the difficulty. Let's go from there.
Because of the difficulty raised by Rav Murray. For Rav Murray challenged Rabbi Yitzchak's statement. Our Mishnah states that as regards the sanctity of Shiloh, there is a permit of Bamot after it is destroyed. Whereas as regards the sanctity of Jerusalem, there is no permit of Bamot after it is destroyed, and they remain forbidden. Thus, the Mishnah clearly contradicts Rabbi Yitzchak's statement that sacrifices are permitted in the temple of Chonyo after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And furthermore, we learned in a different Mishnah, from when they came to Jerusalem, the Bamot again became forbidden, and they were never again permitted. And it was the inheritance referred to in the Torah. We see from this Mishnah as well that Bamot were not permitted after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, unlike Rabbi Yitzchak's statement to the contrary. Therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak retracted.
Okay, so what Rava is saying is that Rav Murray brought out some pretty heavy-duty texts, some pretty heavy authoritative teachings to challenge what Rabbi Yitzchak said. So the first is our own Mishnah here in Megillah, where it's explicitly saying that's exactly the difference between Shiloh and Yerushalayim. The difference is that no, after Shiloh, there were the possibilities of people sacrificing any other place that they felt moved to do so. But after Shiloh, after Yerushalayim, then forget it.
No,
That's it.
no.
Yerushalayim closed the doors on that possibility. That's one thing, right? So, and let's look at the last two lines of the Mishnah. It's at the top of 10a. Okay, we have that page in front of us, right?
We
Where it
will.
says,
Oh, I see.
the same page we're reading.
Yeah, whereas
Right.
there is a permit after blah, 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 that is after the destruction of the Shiloh tabernacle, Bamot were again permitted. Whereas, as regards the sanctity of Jerusalem, there is no permit after it. That is, even after the temple's destruction, Bamot remain prohibited.
Okay, so I want to just, it's a little, that's the inference we make from this Mishnah. Again, that's all editorial font here,
Yeah.
right? The statement in the Mishnah is, and this holiness of Jerusalem, there is no permit after it. But if we wanted to argue, or if we wanted to be a little more, insistent, can you please clarify that a little bit? That doesn't necessarily say that once Jerusalem is destroyed, that Bamot can't be erected. Once Jerusalem is established, then after that, there are no Bamot. I could insist that that's what the Mishnah says. Right? Once Jerusalem has been built, the temple in Jerusalem is built, after that, no more Bamot. So as soon as Ezra and Nehemiah, supervised the completion of the building of the temple, so from 450 BCE, no more Bamot. But what happens if the temple, God forbid, is destroyed?
Right.
Maybe then the Bamot are allowed. Maybe Rabbi Yitzchak's statement that the temple in Chonyo would be permitted, maybe that is allowed. So that's why we have now this second Mishnah in Zvachim, right? And that's where it says, and furthermore, we learned in a different Mishnah, and here the statement is a little more explicit, where it says, read it please one more time. You got it, Bill?
Yep.
In the middle there.
And furthermore, we learned in a different Mishnah, from when they came to Jerusalem, the Bamot again became forbidden, and they were never again permitted.
So here's that extra phrase. And that's it, period. Never again, ever. Even after the destruction of Jerusalem, there is no more permit to have a sacrificial site outside of Jerusalem. So that explicitly rules out the possibility that Rabbi Yitzchak said we could have we could do sacrifices in the temple of Onias, in the temple of Chonyo. This Mishnah really puts it out there black on white, okay? And it says, why? Because the temple in Jerusalem was their inheritance. It was the Nachala. So again, look back at note 1 under the line there,
Yep.
right? And if you see, you can read, look at the big paragraph, that Bamot became permitted. Go ahead.
Yep. That Bamot became permitted with the destruction of Shiloh is derived from scripture by the Gemara in Zvachim 119a as follows. The permit of Bamot is contained in the Torah statement, cited also in the Gemara below, for you have not yet come to the resting place and to the inheritance.
Okay, so these are the two words, Kilo batem el hamenucha vela nachla. So that's the verse. So menucha is then applied to Shiloh, time where everything rested for a while, but rest is temporary, like Shabbos. Shabbos is followed by Sunday where there's no rest. But nachala is permanent. Inheritance is permanent. And so then that's Jerusalem. So that's what the Mishnah itself alludes to this Midrash Halacha, where the Mishnah in Zvachim says, and Jerusalem was the Nachala. So the word Nachala is actually a word that's being cited from a verse, and the whole Midrash Halacha of that verse is assumed to be known by the people who are reading the Mishnah. And that's now this idea of, that's it, once and for all, no more Bamot once we get to Jerusalem, even after the destruction of Jerusalem. So these two Mishnayot work hand in hand. And by the time we finished with both of these Mishnayot, which were concluded, 2 generations or more before Rabbi Yitzchak, so Rabbi Yitzchak doesn't have a leg to stand on. Rabbi Yitzchak said, well, I think we can, I've heard that you could actually do these sacrifices outside of Jerusalem. Rabbi Mori said, excuse me, here we have the Mishnah that says you cannot. So who do you think you are? Right? So as a result, Rabbi Yitzchak has no authority to contradict these Mishnayot. And therefore, he has to say, no. I take it back. I take it back. Right? And this is both a question of authority, and it's also a question of knowledge. Don't you know the simple ABCs that were established? To not know a Mishnah is to say to a scholar you don't know your ABCs, right? Yeah, the Mishnah is basic. Everybody was supposed to know the Mishnah. So here are 2 Mishnayot that together certainly seem to be saying the opposite of Rabbi Yitzchak, and therefore he took it all back. Right? Okay, Jen, you said you wanted to say something. Yeah.
I just have a question because I'm always kind of fascinated by what rabbis are saying then or later, as opposed to what Jews at the time actually did. So I think like what we have in the Tanakh, it seems like even after the temple in Jerusalem, people were still making sacrifices at high places. Yeah. There was never any example of it after the temple of Jerusalem.
So that you don't complicate it. The Tanakh, certainly the Tanakh is closed by the time we have Second Temple business.
Right.
The Tanakh is all about the chaos of the first temple and before. Right?
Right.
The Tanakh
But
period.
during First Temple times, we did not have high places.
First temple times we did.
We did. Okay.
And the Tanakh, there's a lot of noise coming from someplace.
Oh, I'm sorry, because I'm outside. Let me turn off my volume. I'm sorry.
So that's where the rabbis try to walk this line of bamot, individual or even communal sacrificial altars were allowed at certain periods. That's their answer. Historically speaking, they say there were certain centralized shrines that were established temporarily. And when they were established, nobody else could do something. But if they then went by the wayside, Shiloh didn't exist forever. Shiloh was destroyed. Then again, people could do bamot. So a lot of the evidence that they would say is in Tanakh is okay because it was at times when these central shrines didn't exist.
So what about?
Wait, that's number one.
Okay.
Number two, the Tanakh is pretty explicit many times that those high places are terrible, that they were wrong, and that only the pious kings destroyed them, but other people either played along with them or tolerated them, right? That's the 929, went through months and months and months of the 929 group of reading all of Kings, where that's back and forth about that. Number three, Jerusalem's centrality was not accepted by the Northern Kingdom. So you have 10 tribes, however many people that was, under a political regime that explicitly rejected Jerusalem because they didn't want the central shrine to be in the Southern Kingdom. They wanted to have a shrine, so they created their shrines, Shechem and so on. So, but from the perspective of the rabbis, all of that was sinful. So that doesn't count. That's not what we're not talking about the people that do things that are sinful. We're talking about when Rabbi Yitzchak says, I hear that this is okay, this is legitimate. That's what raises the eyebrows.
Okay. So what is? I think you said this, and I just didn't hear it. But what is the timing on the Temple of Onias? Like,
So I talked about that last time. The Temple of Onias was actually created in the 2nd century BCE.
so that's contemporary with the Second Temple.
Yeah, with the second temple. And this, now we're in Rabbi Yitzchak and following, is the middle of the 3rd century CE. So we're hundreds of years later, but the temple of Onias was when the 2nd temple was actually standing. And what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying, which is, both historically startling and also halachically startling, is I heard that if we could imagine the temple of Onias functioning today, hundreds of years down the road, and maybe even a couple of hundred years after the 2nd temple was destroyed, it would be okay. And I mentioned last week as well, it's not clear if he's saying this as a hypothetical, or if he's using the Temple of Onias and saying, there are still people that are offering sacrifices, whether in Egypt or other places, and that's okay. Is it a hypothetical, or is it actually he's a reflection of the fact that some people are doing this?
So does that mean that while they were writing these, not everybody was necessarily following what they said? Like as they're arguing this about.
That's a given always, right? Even to this very day. I know,
yes.
Shocking as it is for you to imagine that, not everybody follows what the rabbis say you should do, right? Even to this very moment. So yes, this is a conversation that's within a particular context, a particular community that exists within a much larger and much more variegated community. There was one other thing I wanted to say and I lost it. Yeah, Stuart.
I mean, isn't there a reading though, if you think about it from their perspective, if you were living in the time of the temple, it's unimaginable to you that there won't be a temple, it's eternal. And so of course you would say that there will never be an alternative to this. But if the temple is destroyed, then it seems like the whole premise of that rule is no longer present. I mean, it's like we say, imagine American democracy. We accept it as forever, and if it's not here, then everything changes.
Right. You're right. That's what we are reading about a conversation that happened after the destruction of the Second Temple, where the assumptions that people may have had once upon a time, although whether those assumptions that you're making, the assumptions you're making about their assumptions, it's not so clear that they made those assumptions.
But the proof text of the Mishnah just, it's not as clear as suggested.
No, this is all their analysis. Here we are, 200 years after the destruction of the temple. How do we read our history? How do we understand where we are today? How much has changed, like you say, and how much has stayed the same? How much is indestructible, right? And a serious part of rabbinic Judaism is in resistance to the cataclysmic changes that happened politically, socially, economically, etc., to the Jewish people because of their living within this Roman Empire, and to a certain extent, the Sasanian Empire in Babylonia. So this is all, a lot of it is resistance, counterculturalism, and in terms of a positive statement, positively creating a viewpoint and a way of life based on that viewpoint that can sustain itself and that sees itself as continuous with all the way back through the millennia to the creation of the world. So they're suffering the shocks and the jolts of historical events, and then they're trying to figure out, well, how much of this changes things and how much doesn't. That's exactly the conversation that we're having. Now, your speculation about what did people actually believe when the Second Temple was around? Did they really believe that it was eternal? That's a human nature is always to think that whatever we have now is eternal. But on the other hand, they had what people in the First Temple didn't have, which is a memory of the destruction of the First Temple. So they did already know that something that once upon a time people thought was a done deal ended up not being a done deal. So, this is, they lost their innocence a long time ago. And back and forth, the Temple of Onias, again, back to things that we talked about last week, came about at a time of great turmoil in the Second Temple. The Second Temple itself was not just this like peaceful inheritance, the Nachala, right? That it was a contended site that different people were fighting over, and that people were struggling both over the running of it and the view of it. So that's another part of it. The one part that the point that I wanted to make before that I forgot that I want to say is, again, this is sort of all back. This is back story. But something that every once in a while we touch on, certainly when we look through the book of Leviticus, when we read it every Shabbat during a certain part of the year, and that is, what the hell ever happened to sacrifices? Where are they? That what was taken for granted as a religious norm for thousands and thousands of years, where is it today? So it happens to be that not only was the Second Temple destroyed and the sacrificial system in Jerusalem pretty much ceased, and again, were there certain people that were still sacrificing? Were there certain places that were still sacrificing? History never just stops on a dime. But overall, throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Roman world, the Romans sacrificed all over the place. The Romans also, by the time we get to the 2nd century CE, people are not sacrificing. By and large, those things are passé. So there's this interesting historical coincidence of a national tragedy for the Jewish people, depriving them of their sacrificial shrine, that coincides with a historical change in the zeitgeist, where people are not all that crazy about sacrificing anyway. So it's very intriguing and it's very perplexing and not, we can talk about, about that after we finish learning all of Tractate Megillah. We can set up a kind of like a seminar on how historical consciousness changes in history, something like that. Yeah, Jen.
Well, I feel like, didn't we go through this once before when the first temple was destroyed? Like, didn't we have this crisis then? Where are we going to sacrifice and stuff?
But historically speaking, that was a kind of a blink of the eye, because that was like 70 years, 2 generations, and we were back. We were back in business. I mean, we were struggling, and it's complicated, and only a minority of people came back to this, to Judea. But there was enough, there was enough memory, enough living memory of the past, that when the restoration happened, it was, just say, oh, whew, boy, again, like in the shul burned down, and then we rebuilt the shul.
Okay, so
that was pretty much what I mean. Again, I'm oversimplifying.
Right. No, that's fine.
But, I mean, there were cataclysmic changes in Jewish living from the first temple construction, but in terms of the temple itself, when you have in Ezra and Nehemiah, they report very, very beautifully and very touchingly that they're building the second temple, and there are people that remember the first temple, and they're crying because it doesn't live up to their memories of the first temple. This is just not good enough. And there are other people that are dancing and singing. Look at that, we did it again. They didn't keep us down. We're back. We're back on top. So that was close enough people's living memory for it to be able to sort of like keep on going. The appalling thing about the second temple's destruction was, for a while they thought, we'll just do it. We'll get it right away. We'll get it soon. And I mentioned Julian last time, Emperor Julian. There was still this idea. Now we'll finally get it. Now we'll pay off the authorities and everything will be fine. And then it went on and went on.
And then people didn't like pluralism, and he was assassinated or otherwise died.
Or whatever. Yeah. Or whatever. We're not going into Roman history. Yes.
I'm curious too, though. Like, so if you're in diaspora, nowhere near the temple, like, I mean, you're not making sacrifices. What do you do? Just donate to the temple periodically, and you don't get involved in the hot mess of whatever politics are going on there? Are you as devastated as, I guess you're devastated because of the loss of life, and the temple is symbolic to you, but you're already used to not having sacrifices. You're already used to your local synagogue, etc.
But you're used to having the sacrifices being done there on your behalf.
Do you switch to Onias at that point then?
So that's a little bit what Rabbi Yitzchak seems to be hinting at, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is you go on the Hajj. You recognize that central place as being so deeply embedded in your heart, and you try to get there at least once in your life. So, Philo says how moved he was to be able to go and make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
And I assume he knew the Temple of Onias too. He must have done, right? So
and again, by that time, whether there was a Temple of Onias or not, this is a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Sylvia.
Well, I was just thinking, it right up to date. I happened to notice the other day that in the reconstruction of Notre Dame, which was built in the 16th century.
Oh no!
Earlier.
Way before.
Notre Dame,
whatever century it was built.
Construction or the reconstruction?
The construction.
The construction.
The original construction. It goes back 700 years. Whatever. I'm not sure what. Anybody tell me? I don't really know offhand what it is. But what they've done now is they're using 3D technology to X-ray the entire building to find where every stone came from, so that they could reconstruct it exactly. So they're not moving to anything. I mean, that's their temple of Jerusalem in Paris, after all.
That's a cultural icon, and it's got so much history to it, and so
right. I understand, but what I'm saying is they want to restore it
They
to
want to
where
restrict, right,
it was
right.
originally. They're not, they're not saying, okay, this
Right,
is
well,
now where we are. Where do we go from here?
Right. Well, again, on the other hand, the Notre Dame Cathedral is one of thousands of cathedrals, no matter how wonderful it is and no matter how special it is. Paris is not short on beautiful, amazing
Well,
cathedrals.
they would do this at the Vatican. I mean, it would be the same thing.
Yeah, so Jerusalem was one and only.
Right.
Okay, so we have this challenge to Rabbi Yitzchak, and he says, okay, I withdraw my motion. I take it back, right? Okay. Now the Gemara. The Gemara now.
The
Last
Gemara
few
now,
lines.
the Gemara now demonstrates that it is a Tanaitic dispute whether the initial sanctity of Jerusalem ceased upon the temple's destruction. This is a dispute between Tanaim. For we learned in the Mishnah,
Now we're on
Rabbi-
10a2.
Rabbi Eliezer said, I heard from my teachers that when they were building the sanctuary of the second temple in the days of Ezra, they made curtains for the sanctuary and curtains for the temple court, which surrounded the sanctuary, to serve as temporary partitions until the actual walls were constructed. But in the case of the sanctuary, they built the wall on the outside of the curtains, whereas in the case of the temple court, they built the wall on the inside of the curtains. The Mishnah continues.
Okay,
And
so
Rabbi-
1 second. So just let's get this. So this is now trying to reconstruct literally. How was the temple actually built? How did they go about it? When they have this, as I said before, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have a report about the process being done. And apparently the altar was built first. But now we have different parts of the temple. Remember, there's an altar where sacrifices are given. That's at the outside half of the temple. Then there's the Heichal, the sanctuary, what is called here, the Heichal is where the Holy of Holies is where the menorah is, where the table with the bread is. So, and the incense altar is in there. So there's an inside area of the sanctuary, and here called the sanctuary, the Heichal, the palace. And then there's the outside, which is an enclosed courtyard. And then in the middle of that courtyard is the altar for the sacrifices, and everybody could then see it from outside, right? So Rabbi Eliezer says, how did they go about actually setting up this thing when it was still a construction site? How did they actually establish these different holy areas? Because each area has its own holiness. This is delineated. We had a little bit of it before, but it's delineated in other parts of the Mishnah and some of the Talmud. But it's in the Mishnah as well. So he says, I heard when they were in the middle of the construction, right? That they made curtains before they had the walls themselves. The temple was built with solid, stone walls. But before they could delineate that here's the sanctuary, here's the interior part of the temple, that's going to be the external, the courtyard part of the temple. How did they do it? Did they just take chalk and make lines on the outside on the ground and say, okay, that's the inside, that's the outside? No, they actually created inside and outside with temporary curtains. So they made curtains for the sanctuary, curtains for the temple court, and the temple for the sanctuary, they built the wall on the outside of the curtains. Okay, so the curtains were within the space of the sanctuary, and then the wall was outside of the sanctuary space, so that the wall, the inside of the wall was exactly the beginning of the sanctuary space. Right? The wall didn't take up any of the sanctuary space. Okay? With regard to the temple court, the outside court, the wall was inside. The wall was actually built on the ground that was the courtyard ground. Okay, so that's what he says, that's how they did it. If you look at 16.
15, that is the main temple building which
No,
housed the
16.
16, sorry. At the start of the construction, they erected these makeshift partitions of curtains to serve in place of the permanent walls, which would not be completed for another 22 years.
Okay, so the temporary dividers were these like tent-like walls, these tarps, right? Okay, so that's 17.
Note 17, that is, in the case of the sanctuary, the makeshift curtains had been stretched across the inner edge of the site of the permanent wall, so that the workers constructing the permanent wall would not enter the sanctuary. That's Rashi's interpretation. In the case of the temple court, however, the curtains were stretched across the outer edge of the wall site, and the workers stood inside the court while constructing the permanent wall.
Right, so abiding by these different levels of sanctity, the sanctity of the Heichal, the sanctity of the inside space, is greater than the sanctity of the outside space. That's the whole point. The outside space is more accessible to the public. So the workers building the wall were put outside the space so that the wall itself was exactly at the edge of the space, and the inside of the wall was where the space began. And they were making the wall presumably only on one side, on the outside. So that's the way we're imagining it today. Of course, this construction of the temple is an ongoing thing, just like, we Notre Dame, and all the cathedrals, what's the one, St. John the Divine, right? It's still being constructed as we speak, right?
St. John the Unfinished.
St. John the Unfinished, yes. So, but construction and repair, look, any of us that knows anything about living inside a structure, it's endless, right? Painting bridges is forever, right? So as soon as you finish, you start again. So what about when there had to be a repair? So this is something that Rav Kook is famously credited with saying. And he said that the Holy of Holies was out of bounds for everybody, even the priests, right? And even the high priest, except on the Day of Atonement, right? So he said, but what if if a pipe broke inside the Holy of Holies? What if there was a leak in the roof? Then what? The answer is, then the workers come in and they fix it. You have to fix it. So then it's anybody. So he said, this was his explanation for where we were in terms of building up the land of Israel, where there were a lot of people that were really angry. What are all these chalutzim, all these pioneers? They're not loyal to the Torah. They're secularists. They're atheists. They do whatever they want. And yet we are supposed to credit them that they're doing something holy by building up the land of Israel in modern times. And this was Rav Kook's answer. Rav Kook's answer is, when you're talking about repairing and building up, anybody can do that. Once we have a fully established, constructed, so to speak, sanctuary again, then we'll be able to go back to the rules of who can go into which part when. But right now we're not in that spot. So that's a little bit here of taking precautions, though. That doesn't mean that therefore it's a free-for-all. The taking precautions is the curtains, and they're establishing inside or outside the space. Okay, so that's Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. And now we're back in the text of the Talmud, left-hand side in the middle of that paragraph. And Rabbi Yehoshua said.
The Mishnah continues. And Rabbi Yehoshua said, I heard from my teachers that we may offer sacrifices at the temple site, even though there is no sanctuary building standing at present, and that the Kohanim may eat Kodshei Kodashim on the site of the temple court, even though there are no curtains, that is, wall around the temple court standing at present. And we may eat Kodashim Kalim and Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem, even though there is no wall around Jerusalem at present, because the initial sanctification of Jerusalem and its temple sanctified for its time and sanctified for all future time. That is, the sacred status is retained even after the destruction of the temple and the walls.
Okay, so now we have Rabbi Yehoshua bringing us back to this moment, right? Rabbi Eliezer seems to be talking about ancient historical times when the temple was first being built. And then Rabbi Hoshua turns it around and goes, let's talk about now. Let's talk about when we don't have a temple anymore. And he says, curtains, you're talking about that they put up curtains to delineate the spaces. Now we don't have curtains and we still have delineated spaces. And the spaces retain their sanctity and they retain their special power, even now, even though there is no permanent wall and there's no temporary wall. We don't need to have that kind of physical definition of the space. We know the space already. The space was defined once and for all, and therefore we can still have sacrifices in the place where the altar stood. As long as you know where that place is holy forever and ever and ever. And you could do that. And all of the things that needed to take place in the temple, you couldn't eat. The priests couldn't eat the sacrificial parts that were given to them, the kochei kodashim. They couldn't eat them outside the temple. They had to be eaten within the temple precincts. So you don't need the walls. You don't need even curtains. If they know where the temple is, let them take the sacrificial parts that belong to them and let them eat them on behalf of God and Israel in that sacred space. The sacred space is always there. Okay, so these are the examples that he gives. For us, if we have Maaser Sheni, the second Maaser, which is a Maaser that besides the 10% that we're supposed to give, the tithes that we're supposed to give to the Levites, we're supposed to bring 10% of our produce up to Jerusalem and eat it in Jerusalem. So he says, guess what? We could do that now, even though the walls of Jerusalem have fallen or been, breached. We know that also that was a holy thing, to fix the walls and keep repairing the walls and so on. So if the walls have been torn down in different places and we don't have a real enclosure of the holy space, it doesn't matter. Okay, so we could do it. Why? Because the eternal sanctity of Jerusalem cannot be destroyed. Hold on, David has a note. Do we think we know these locations even today? So that's a good question. There's a whole literature on that. Different archaeologists and different rabbis have written about this. It's the answer is we pretty much know, but then it gets a little vague in the details. But the Temple Mount, we know the Temple Mount. We know that that's the place where the temple stood, and pretty much where the Dome of the Rock is, pretty much was where the Holy of Holies was. So I think I could have to go back and check and correct myself. But all right.
Isn't the Dome of the Rock the high point on that hill?
Well, that is not a hill there. That's a plateau.
But it's the high. There's nothing higher than that.
Than the Dome of the Rock?
Yeah. Is there?
I mean, there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Which one is higher? Which is
the base
higher?
of it. The base.
The Golden Dome is higher, right? So that's the Dome of the Rock. Now you just went mute. No,
I meant the base. In other words, you're building from
the base. The base is not the base of what it was built. 1,000 years after the temple. That's not relevant to us. We're talking about, the spot, the longitude and latitude.
Right. That's where the base goes.
Right. Okay. But then how high you build it doesn't matter.
That doesn't matter.
Right. Okay. So now back to here. Okay. The Gemara now analyzes our Mishnah.
The Gemara now analyzes the Mishnah just cited. This implies that Rabbi Eliezer, who notes that curtains were hung pending completion of the walls, holds that the initial sanctity did not sanctify for all future time. That is, the sanctity ceased with the destruction of the temple. Therefore, he maintains that curtains had to be hung to re-sanctify the site in order to allow the offering of all sacrifices pending the temple's construction. We thus have a dispute between the Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, regarding the sanctity of the site after the destruction of the temple.
Okay, so these are a number of assumptions that the Gemara is making. We have a Mishnah where we have two sages, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, saying each their own thing. And it doesn't quite in the Mishnah present their two sayings as in contradiction to each other, but the Mishnah is assuming that it is. So if Rabbi Yoshua, the second sage, says explicitly that the sanctity of the temple is eternal and indestructible, they're assuming now Rabbi Eliezer, who often argues with Rabbi Yoshua, he must argue with Rabbi Yoshua, and he's probably the one who thinks that the temple's sanctity is destructible and is vulnerable to erasure. Let's look at 21. Note 21.
Note 21. The wording of the Mishnah seems to imply that Rabbi Yehoshua related his tradition in response to the one related by Rabbi Eliezer. Accordingly, Rabbi Yehoshua must have understood from Rabbi Eliezer's remarks that the initial sanctity was not for all time, which is why Rabbi Yehoshua countered with the tradition that it was.
Okay, so now what's the function of the curtains for Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that the sanctity of Jerusalem is a little shaky, so to speak? 22.
Note 22. According to the view that the sanctity ceased with the destruction of the first temple, the re-sanctification was accomplished by erecting the partitions and rededicating the site with the procedures detailed in the Mishnah Shavuot 14a.
Okay, so in other words, we're not just looking at history, but apparently what Rabbi Eliezer was saying is when that second temple was built, it had to be rededicated. It had to be re-sanctified, and that's what the curtains did. What the curtains did was they defined this specific space for its specific level of holiness. Even though the walls would take much longer, we wanted this space to become sanctified right now. So we created the walls, not just simply as a handy way of knowing what's what and where's where, but they actually performed a sanctificational function. And that's what would be needed anytime the holiness would be destroyed again. So this is the way that the Gemara is now understanding what Rabbi Eliezer understood to be necessary, a re-sanctification of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's sanctity was lost. Now, I want to again mention that we keep talking about the first sanctification in the times of Joshua, and then Ezra, the building of the second temple, is possibly a second sanctification. And this goes back to what we were talking about before. We could either put them together or we could separate them. We could say the first sanctification was temporary. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. But then there was a second sanctification. They built a second temple. They put the curtains up. They re-sanctified the whole temple. And then that sanctification was never destroyed. It could never be destroyed. That's Maimonides' view. But the alternative view is no, that sanctification could be destroyed. So in this Gemara now, we're assuming that both the first and the second sanctifications are equally vulnerable to destruction. And if the first is sanctification could be destroyed, then the second also could be destroyed, right? In fact, how much more so? Because the first sanctification was with Joshua and with all of the tribes. It was like a big deal. With Ezra, it was a very partial phenomenon. So if Joshua's sanctification could fall apart, then Ezra's sanctification, which was necessary to be reestablished, but then it also was only temporary and could fall apart. Okay, so this is our assumption now that Rabbi Eliezer does not agree with Rabbi Yehoshua. Okay. Also, on the other side, Rabbi Yehoshua says, curtains, schmertens, we don't need curtains, right? We just need to know where we are. Yeah, Sylvia.
I probably am missing something, and forgive me if I am, but what was there about the spot that we called Jerusalem that made it sanctified in the first place?
God said so.
Exactly. Thank you, Josie.
But he said Jerusalem?
Yeah, and he said that spot.
And he said that that hill, that particular area.
Right. This is, go read again, Kings. This is the whole drama with David and Solomon, right? And this is a vision that they get. Yes, this is the right spot.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
I have a question.
Okay, and like I said, the 10 tribes in the Northern Kingdom said, forget about it. We're not going to accept it. Okay, the Gemara.
The Gemara, however, questions this explanation of Rabbi Eliezer's view. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, how is it proven that Rabbi Eliezer takes the sanctity of Jerusalem and its temple to cease upon their destruction?
Wait. I just want to say 1 second.
Yep.
I want to go backwards now for a second. According to this place where we are now in our discussion, whether the sanctification of Jerusalem and et cetera, all of the complications, whether it was permanent or not, according to this reading of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua's disagreement, yeah, it's a disagreement. According to that, our Mishnah, which says that Jerusalem, once it was built, no more sacrifices anyplace else, that Mishnah follows, our Mishnah in Megillah, follows Rabbi Yeshua. But Rabbi Eliezer, according to the way we've just concluded, doesn't agree with our Mishnah. And according to the way that we've worked out these positions, our Mishnah is only the viewpoint of Rabbi Yeshua, not Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, Rav Murray's challenge to Rav Yitzchak was, how can you contradict an explicit Mishnah? Well, now we see, according to this Gemara discussion, he can say, I'm not contradicting an explicit Mishnah on my own. I'm simply following a different Tana. This Mishnah is one opinion, but I follow the other opinion. In which case, Rabbi Yitzchak wouldn't have had to retract, or wouldn't have had to back down. He's within his rights to follow a different Tana. So this is a problem we'll get to later on. But this is part of this, what makes this whole sugya a little convoluted and a little messy. And now we're going to go back again and to say your interpretation of this disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is also open to disagreement. Go ahead.
Perhaps, according to everyone, both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, the initial sanctification sanctified for its time and sanctified for all future time, and there is no dispute between them. Rather, the one master, Rabbi Eliezer, reported what he had heard, and one master, Rabbi Yehoshua, reported what he had heard. And if you will argue, why then, according to Rabbi Eliezer, were curtains needed, if not to sanctify the site, I will answer that they were needed merely for privacy, to prevent people from looking in while the Kohanim were performing the service. Thus, we have no proof from here that there is a Tanaitic dispute whether the initial sanctity ceases with the temple's destruction.
Okay, so now the Gemara says, wait a second. Maybe everybody does agree that the initial sanctity is eternal. And again, to say that the sanctities can fall apart is a very difficult thing to embrace, right? It will make everybody feel a lot better to feel that the sanctity is forever and ever. So there's a push to try to affirm that. So let's get Rabbi Eliezer on our side. And let's say that everybody thinks that the sanctity, once it's established forever, once and for all. Well, what is Rabbi Eliezer then doing? So here the Gemara says, maybe Rabbi Eliezer said, what did Rabbi Eliezer say? Shamati, I heard. And actually that's a little theme here because that's what Rabbi Yitzchak also said. Shamati, shemakrivim bebeit chonyo, right? It's that I heard. Now this is what I heard. So what the Gemara now says is, maybe what Rabbi Eliezer is doing is simply telling us historically how things worked, but it has no halachic implication. The curtains were, as Freud would say, they were simply curtains. They weren't sanctifying the space. They were put up because people felt that it was the right thing. It felt better that this holy place of serving God shouldn't just be out there like an open wilderness. So until the walls were to be created, they put up temporary partitions. But it wasn't because you needed the partition to make the place holy. The place was holy. It was the holiness that made the partitions necessary. And therefore, it was much more than proper, appropriate to have a kind of a private space for the priests to, perform their functions without it being just like in the middle of a village square. It was much more honorable. It was much more modest. But it had nothing to do with the necessity of sanctifying the space. And what Rabbi Yoshua was saying, he's not against the curtains. He didn't say that back in the old days they didn't have curtains. What he's saying is, in terms of the sanctity, the curtains are not determinative. The curtains don't make or break the sanctity of the space. Maybe they're just talking about what, they also say, shamati, shamati. So we have this theme, this motif that's recurrent of people saying things that we are imagining they're saying as halachic pronouncements, and yet they're couching it as, what I heard? Interesting, I heard this, right? And then even with Rava, when after Rabbi Yitzchak says, I take it back, what did Rava say? Don't say, he can't take it back. I heard him say it, right? So there's this whole hearing thing going on here. And the question is, how much weight do we put to the report that somebody says when they say they heard it? Are they just talking history or are they talking law? Okay, now, if we have this rereading of the Mishnah of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, what does this do back to Rabbi Yitzchak? Then he gets in trouble again, right? Then there is no Tana for him to ally himself with. If we take Rabbi Eliezer as agreeing with Rabbi Yoshua, then there is no split, and then Rav Yitzchak has nobody to rely on. He has no earlier authority to support his position. So then he's back again, being pushed into the corner where he'll have to retract his statement, right? So that's where we are now. Guess what? It ain't over yet. Okay, the Gemara.
The Gemara, however, shows from different sources that the matter is indeed a Tanaitic dispute. Rather, the dispute can be found according to these following Tanaim, for it was taught in a Baraita. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said, why did the sages of the Mishnah enumerate specifically these cities as examples of cities surrounded by walls at the time of Joshua? Because when the exiles ascended to Eretz Yisrael in the time of Ezra, they found these walled cities that are enumerated by the Mishnah, and they sanctified them. But the sanctity of the other original walled cities became nullified when the sanctity of the land was nullified at the time of the first destruction and exile. The Gemara observes, thus we see that Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, holds that the initial sanctification sanctified for its time, but did not sanctify for all future time. That is, the sanctity ceased with destruction.
Okay, so now we found another place. We found another statement and another discussion, which seems to again bring up the idea that, guess what? Sanctification or sanctity is fragile, and it can be destroyed. So where's the context this time? The context this time is walled cities. So let's look at note 25.
Note 25. The Mishnah in Arachin 32a enumerates a number of cities that were surrounded by walls at the time of Joshua, and whose houses thus had the status of houses in walled cities.
So 1 second, before we get why we need it, what do we need to know about these houses? Where have we had a significant halachic significance about walled cities from the time of Joshua?
In the discussion of the Megillah,
right.
where it was read and when it was read.
Correct. So we have, this is the Tractate Megillah. In fact, that's where we sort of start from, right? Who's reading Megillah where and when? When are we celebrating Purim and when we're not celebrating Purim? And we had this criterion that walled cities from the time of Joshua celebrate Purim a day after everybody else, right?
Right.
That's not the original place where walled cities from the time of Joshua had significance, because that's, of course, a post-biblical, post-5 books of Moses phenomenon, right? Purim is a much later holiday. But there is, from the 5 books of Moses, a significance to walled cities from the time of Joshua, because the Torah itself makes a distinction in the time of the Jubilee year between walled cities from the time of Joshua and open spaces. Open spaces go back to their original owner at the Jubilee, but walled cities have a different rule. Let's continue.
The significance of a house in a walled city is that the owner who sells the house has but 1 year to redeem it by buying it back. If the house is not redeemed by the anniversary of the sale, the house becomes the permanent property of the buyer. Houses that are not in walled cities, however, may be redeemed at any time, and if not redeemed, they automatically revert to the original owner in the Jubilee year.
Okay, so that's the thing. Walled cities and the houses they're in are not subject to the Jubilee year rule. Okay, Jubilee only applies to the open countryside. So now we had to know, okay, where do we have these cities that were walled in from the time of Joshua? And the Mishnah and Erechin, Arachin, enumerates, okay, here's where the Jubilee year does not apply. Okay.
In this Baraita, Rabbi Ishmael inquires why only these few cities were enumerated, when there were in fact many more cities walled in Joshua's time, as the Mishnah itself concludes here, and similarly all other cities like them. That's Rashi's view. Rashi cites the Mishnah there as enumerating 9 cities, but our versions contain only 8. Rashash
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Says
explains that Rashi's version of the Mishnah also listed the city of Lod. See Rashi, etc.
okay, so that's not important for us. But we have a limited number of cities that are listed in the Mishnah, far fewer than the cities that we know from the book of Joshua that were walled cities at the time of Joshua. So the Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah only enumerate those cities? And now the answer is, we're assuming, therefore, that those cities are the only cities that were restored to their holy sanctification. The other cities were not re-sanctified. So that's why these are the ones that are mentioned. Only the walled cities that are sanctified have this rule that exempts them from Jubilee. But any other city is then going to be just like open countryside. So now this shows us that when Ezra came back in and the Jews came back to Judea, they had to re-sanctify these cities. That means that the first sanctity disappeared. The first sanctity was destroyed with the exile. So therefore we see that the first sanctification was for its time, but not forever. Did not continue forever. Okay. Okay, we got a few more minutes. This is very exciting. We're gonna cover a little more ground here.
Talk fast. Thus we see that Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, holds that the initial sanctification sanctified for its time, but did not sanctify for all future time. That is, the sanctity ceased with destruction. Yet they pointed out a contradiction in the view of Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. For another Baraita states, Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, were these cities enumerated in the Mishnah in Arachin the only walled cities in the time of Joshua? But was it not already stated in the Torah that Moses and Israel conquered 60 cities, the entire region of Argob? And it is written in the next verse regarding these 60 cities, all these were cities fortified with high walls. Thus there were many cities in Eretz Yisrael that were walled at Joshua's time. Why then did the sages enumerate only these listed in the Mishnah in Arachin? Because when the exiles ascended to Eretz Yisrael, they found along their route of return these walled cities that are enumerated by the Mishnah, and they sanctified them. The Gemara interrupts the citation of the Baraita and objects, Can you say that the Baraita actually means that they sanctified them now upon their return from the exile? But it is said below in this very Baraita that there is no need to sanctify them again.
The Gemara, therefore,
Sorry, the
Keep
Gemara, therefore, amends the Baraita. Rather, we must read the Baraita as follows. They found these cities, and the sages therefore enumerated them, but there was no need to re-sanctify them.
okay, so now in other words, we're back to a confusion. Was it necessary to re-sanctify these cities or not? Right, so we have a back and forth here about how to read the text and the assumptions that go with them. This is important for us to follow up on later. But now, just for the last couple of minutes that we have, last minute, look at note 28.
Note 28. The Gemara initially dealt with the issue of whether the sanctity of Jerusalem and its temple is for all time. The Gemara's assertion here that the issue is the subject of this Tanaitic dispute in regard to the sanctity of walled cities apparently shows that the Gemara considers these two issues to be interdependent. That is, if the sanctity of Jerusalem and its temple ceased with their destruction, then the sanctity of walled cities would cease with their destruction as well, and vice versa. Conversely, if Jerusalem's sanctity is for all time, so is that of walled cities, and vice versa.
Okay, so that's an important assumption that we could say it ain't necessarily so. We could argue that Jerusalem and its temple is in a category of its own. And that category of super sanctity might make it either more eternal or more vulnerable. While the walled cities are a much lesser, much more run-of-the-mill kind of sanctity. And we could argue that their sanctification or lack thereof is because of their own specific conditions. What this note is pointing out is our Gemara is running along, making the assumption that they're all connected, right? But conceptually, we could argue that they're not connected, right? And of course, this in the end will make big messes for post-Talmudic discussions. We'll come back to all of this, God willing, next time. Okay. See you.